let's talk about one of the most random and strange ideas that Netflix has ever had. And after many trailers and speculation and seeing people's opinion go from, "It's horrible," to, "It's cool," we have the live action of One Piece. And I'm a huge enthusiast of live action adaptations of anime, and I have some very objective points to explain why it worked. Hey guys, how are you? I hope you're doing well. I'm Ammonio, the interdimensional demon who talks the most about One Piece on YouTube, and you're on my channel. First, let's clarify that I'm not a big fan of One Piece. I watched some episodes, some movies, and eventually I watched some fights on YouTube. I even watched the Gear 5 Transformation special episode, but my point is that I know what it's about. I know the concepts and most of the characters. So I'm going to talk about One Piece here as a Netflix series and also as an adaptation, including I still can't believe that this series worked. It's as if Doctor Strange had thought of millions of possibilities for this series to be bad, but we are living in the only reality that worked. But come on, this adaptation had two very big barriers that it had to pass. The barrier of transforming a work that was thought to be a manga and an anime into something live action with real actors, and another barrier is the cultural barrier, since this is a Japanese product, with its very oriental style of humor and writing. For an adaptation it is American. In terms of adapting live action to anime, there are two extremes. I feel that Japan has a habit of making more visually literal adaptations, being much more caricatured in their live actions. Just look at Josuke's hair in JoJo's adaptation Part 4, and despite changing several points of the story because of the change of medium, the visuals are there, as extravagant as JoJo usually is. And on the other hand, we have American adaptations like Dragon Ball, which stripped away so much of its source material to be more palatable to American audiences that it was unrecognizable. This adaptation of One Piece, it's in the middle ground, because it understands that it's for a Western audience that probably hasn't had contact with One Piece, and probably hasn't had much contact with anime in general, so the series tries to be an American fantasy series from Netflix more than anything else, but at the same time it accepts what One Piece is, cartoonish. The world of One Piece is crazy, so it's very difficult for you to adapt that world to live action unless you change everything. But in this case they slapped the table and said, "We are not going to change anything." And as a result the series manages to be surprisingly very good. I was talking to some friends who regularly follow One Piece, and they really liked it, and who would have thought that we would be talking about things that could be better in the series, when the expectation was that we would be talking about how bad the series would be, and this is shocking. I think what made me like the series the most was how much more reserved it is, compared to the anime and manga, without losing the fact that it is One Piece. For example, humor is something very present in One Piece, so if this series didn't have a humorous side, I don't think it would work, but the humor of the manga and anime is something that you can adapt very well, not only for live action, but it's also a very oriental type of humor, because there is not much joke in One Piece. What exists is a very silly physical humor, which for Americans would be equivalent to what we see in Looney Tunes. It is very funny, but it is silly. In the live action they opted to use a more Americanized humor focused on dialogues, comic strips and conversation between them, which works very well in the market they are trying to reach. The characters was also another aspect that changed, since they kind of don't act like they should act in the anime, since their personality is much more reserved than in the anime. The character that was more caricatured in my opinion is Luffy, except that the series treats him as dissonant from everyone in this universe. The way he screams, how he speaks, how he acts is always followed by the other characters looking at him and seeing him as a kind of idiotic person, but kind of so that he manages to inspire the other characters. Of course, even though they are more reserved, the characters still have the personalities are very accentuated, so that everyone is charismatic in their own way. In general, the whole cast is very good, and they manage to bring these characters to life, but it's a slightly different version of them. Everyone is amazing, especially Mihawk, who is very badass here. Sanji was a very curious case, as was Sanji, since he is one of the characters that has less screen time among the crew members, and this hinders you a little getting attached to the character, but I really like the way he was adapted, since I'm not that much of a fan of Sanji from the anime, because his jokes get very tiring. He's very perverted in a very silly way, and that annoys me. I think Oda exaggerates Sanji's humor a little, Here in the series he is kind, charismatic, gentleman, and he is still a bore, and it works very well. I wanted Sanjo to be like that in the anime too. So the cast overall is really good, and that more subdued Western style. It's also really cool, while also being a fantasy story in a very over-the-top world, so they also include all that weird stuff that you see in One Piece. Of course there are things that cannot be done the same, and there are things that could be improved, but the scenery is incredible. I think that all the places are very beautiful. The Bartai, for example, was sensational. The idea of putting a lighthouse on top the restaurant that floats in the middle of the sea is great. Even as a matter of logic, you're sailing and you're hungry, you follow the lighthouse to find the restaurant. The costumes were also very good, especially the fisherman, who did a makeup job that was incredible. If these characters were made of CGI it would have looked horrible. I think one of the great merits of this series is that it used the least amount of possible CGI, which does not happen in the Sandman series, for example, where things are very faithful, but everything is very digital and has no weight. One of the things I least liked was the way they adapted Luffy's elastic powers, not because it was in CGI, or because the CGI wasn't that good, but I think the way they adapted it left everything very truncated. For example, the fights in general are very fluid and dynamic, especially Zoro's, while Luffy, when he's not using his powers, fights in a similar way to the other characters, with choreography and dodges, but whenever he is going to throw a punch using his rubber powers, the fight is stagnant, because Luffy is always standing still, and the enemy is also standing still. They couldn't adapt dynamically for him to use his powers in the middle of the action and movement. Instead, the fight always kind of stops for him to use powers and then continues, and that I think made all of Luffy's fights a little dull. Captain Kuro's speed I think is another example of something they didn't know how to translate very well, since the speed effect was very bad. It reminded me of Power Rangers. I think they would have other ways of showing this speed of a better way. Other things I think were well adapted to give dynamism to the fights. For example, Zoro doesn't keep his third sword in his mouth all the time, because that wouldn't be practical for the actor. He only does that in moments very important, to replicate the most iconic moments, and honestly it was better than in the anime, as it gives more weight to the moment when he will use the sword that belonged to his childhood friend. The scene where Mihawk appears for the first time is another example of a scene they did that was different from the anime but which turned out really well, as it was designed to introduce the character, who has a slightly different personality, and at the same time demonstrate his power. The anime even has the part where he cuts the ship in half with his sword, but the scene is totally different. In general I think that if they want to reproduce the scenes from the manga, they don't need to do everything exactly the same, since because it's a live action, there's already a lot of difference. So these scenes could be more thought out for the live action, with the necessary changes for the different audience and for the different format as well. But even with all that I enjoyed it a lot and had a lot of fun. I can even say that I am looking forward to a second season. But if you are a fan of One Piece, do you agree with me? Leave it in the comments, and if you like the video, subscribe to follow the next content. Until next time my people, demonic hugs.